set of information for you here today, talking about specifically some of the concerns in healthcare industry that are growing in importance given recent events, as well as just a general trend of malware actors and attack groups. Just by way of agenda today, we'll be covering these things here in turn. First of all, I'd like to lead into introductions. On the line, we've got Greg Porter. Greg is the founder and a consultant with Allegheny Digital in Pennsylvania, but also supporting a number of industries globally. He has a great insight to the healthcare industry based on his current client base, so he'll be giving us a bit of perspective on how healthcare in particular is affected by the growing trend of attack groups. He's also worked with a number of course developments, as you can see here, and he's also worked quite a bit with the Coordination Center at the Computer Emergency Response Team out of Carnegie Mellon. So thanks very much for your time here today, Greg. Again, my name is Phil Hagan. I'm with Red Canary. We've created a managed threat detection service that is actually built on the BIT9 carbon black sensor, which we'll lead into in a little bit here. Very excited to try and explain to you a little bit about how our platform is very well suited to address some of these growing trends, specifically in the medical industry. Talk a little bit about that. I've also written a course for SANS. It's the Forensics course 572, Network Forensics and Analysis. So it's a very excellent counterpoint to the endpoint-based view that we take with Red Canary and with Carbon Black. And I've done a number of consulting engagements for many years throughout government and commercial spaces as well. I'm also very glad to have on the line with us today Ben Johnson from BIT9 Carbon Black. As you can see, he's the Chief Security Strategist there. Ben's definitely one of the foundational folks on the Carbon Black side of the BIT9 Carbon Black solution. Co-founder and CTO there prior to the merger into the BIT9 environment. Had the great pleasure of working with Ben on a number of our government missions. Suffice to say that we're very glad to have Ben on our side and know that he's one of the good guys. And it was great to see a lot of what we've learned in those previous environments, previous lives, brought out into the commercial market space today. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Greg, who's got a really good set of information on explaining why patient data is at risk to begin with, of course focusing on the healthcare industry itself. So thanks very much for your time for everybody on the line today, and with that, I will turn that to Greg.
Great, thanks Phil, and thanks again to everybody for joining us here this afternoon. I thought we'd start off just with a brief introduction to healthcare spending and why that's important. If you look at the actuarial data that's made available by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, in 2014 it was projected that the United States would spend actually over $3 trillion on healthcare. So by any stretch of the imagination, certainly not a small amount of change. And what's driving a lot of that spend is the High-Tech Act of 2009, so the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, for those of us that like spelling out acronyms. What High-Tech did, it did a number of things, but in particular it incentivized covered entities, so things like hospitals, physician practices, offices and so forth, to adopt health information technologies. So, and the reason for that is we continue to digitize our most sensitive information, our healthcare data. We obviously need platforms to store, process, transmit, and convey this data in a meaningful manner. So things like electronic health record systems, more broadly health information exchanges, and even patient portals, which give patients access to their electronic medical record that may be residing in a number of areas, the cloud or in the on the network of the covered entity. So this creates a number of ways that we can look at this data. We can mine it for big data purposes. We can certainly, from a care provider's standpoint, use it for clinical decision support systems, and ultimately help improve the patient to physician relationship and ultimately the patient's health, most logically. However, that's the good news. On the flip side of that, the FBI estimates that anywhere from 3 to 10% of total healthcare expenditures are dedicated exclusively to healthcare fraud. Now, you don't have to be really deft at calculus or a mathematician, but certainly 3 to 10% of $3 trillion is a significant amount of money, and it's certainly emblematic of why this issue and some of the things that we'll describe over the next several slides around medical identity theft and organizations in healthcare being targeted isn't likely to go away anytime soon. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the investment in health information technology. Certainly, kind of in parallel to that, we have the emergence of the Internet of Things. Really just some exciting developments if you can think about the Apple Health Kit that's been available for a while now, and more recently the Apple Research Kit to enable technology companies to create apps to help, whether it's a consumer, almost ostensibly become their own primary care physician. I want to monitor, for example, how many calories I'm burning per day, what's my resting heart rate, my active heart rate, how many miles did I run. We can certainly achieve that through wearable technologies and some of the devices that the IoT is collecting data and information from. Kind of even looking beyond that, and I think more specifically at healthcare, things like smart medication management. So if a patient is receiving care at home or at a transitional care facility, they can get indicators, lights and verbal communications from a device that will tell them that they need to take their medication. It will even dispense that medicine for them, and can even relay back to the pharmacy or the provider of care that, hey, this prescription or this medication is about to run out. So interesting in terms of how the Internet of Things is enabling the improvement of the point of care. But also, many of these systems, if you think of the clinician that's out in a rural field, maybe a traveling nurse or a physician assistant, who's away from the facility but is accessing the electronic health record system on a mobile device, they need to do that securely. And so transmitting patient data back and forth, we want to make sure that that's done and kind of in conformance to the HIPAA security and privacy regulations. And I would also add, I think really a fascinating area is around ingestible sensors. So as we consume a pill, for example, it's developed to react with the biochemistry of our bodies, maybe the acidity of our stomach contents, for example, and that creates an electrical current, which creates a signal and transmits telemetry data over Bluetooth to an enabled device. And again, it can be mined by clinicians to better enable the patient outcomes and monitor their health. One area that I also wanted to bring to light is around the Clinical Laboratories Improvement Amendment, or CLIA, and the HIPAA privacy rule. And as part of the final omnibus rule in 2013, patients can request a soft copy of their electronic health record, which is terrific, and I think it's relevant. People would want to review that information. However, one of the interesting things about CLIA is that the covered entity can actually send that information, so that health record, over an unencrypted channel, as long as they convey to the patient that, hey, by the way, we're going to send this information to you. It's going to be unencrypted. There are some risks to that. Certainly nothing's going to be intercepted over HTTP or being blasted over the public internet in clear text, but I think we can all appreciate the risk there. And where I'm going with that is that when that medical record lands on that endpoint device, you can think about the ungoverned calamity that is, your Aunt Sally's PC or Uncle Bob's PC. I mean, just likely full of garbageware and malware and so forth. And so, long term, this could very well be facilitating medical identity thieves and identity theft operations. Next slide, please. So a little bit of an overview of patient data flow, kind of from a pre-HIPAA perspective. Even though HIPAA was passed into law in 1996, it took many years before we got to the full electronic protected health information and start to digitize that and make it available on various platforms. But in this instance, if you can look at the patient kind of being centric to this diagram, and so their medical information, at that time, 20 or so years ago, where would it flow to? And generally speaking, there was about anywhere from 30 to 40 different entities. Naturally, it would go to things like an insurance payer for claim submission and processing. You might expect a prescription to get sent and the medical record to get sent perhaps to a pharmacy for fulfillment there. And also maybe to a law firm for some type of workman's compensation review and so on. So we're looking at 30 to 40 different entities, and as we transition to the next slide, kind of a more contemporary view, for today's environment, you can just see it almost becomes a blurred picture. There's so many different entities processing. So if we take one single medical record and we look at all the different entities and endpoints potentially, it's really staggering when you think about the amount of individuals, the number of organizations that would have access potentially to this data. And it's upwards on the conservative side of about 1,500 different organizations that could have access. And I would argue that it's actually much higher than that when you take into consideration the subcontractors of business associates. So regardless of what the number is, it's certainly far greater than it was 20 years ago, and therefore the likelihood of fraud and theft of medical information increases correspondingly. Next slide, please. And so what we have here, and what this leads to, is kind of this unbound healthcare enterprise, meaning that our PHI can be in a number of disparate locations on a number of disparate devices at any point in time. If anybody listening, and I'm sure there are people, you bought a vehicle recently, it's very common today for these vehicles to come with 1 terabyte hard drives, and naturally for storing things like owner's manuals, but also music files. And it gets interesting from a clinician's perspective if you have a habit, and we've seen it firsthand sometimes when we're talking with physicians and clinical staff, that sometimes they'll take notes in their contact list, and if they happen to sync that with their automobile, well, you have another conduit where PHI may be getting stored in the vehicle, so just something to be mindful of. You would hope that the likelihood of interception would be low, but with Bluetooth-enabled technologies and the way that these systems are communicating in the vehicle and beyond that, personal area networks, it's a risk that certainly needs to be accounted for. Moving over to the device side, we may have situations where BYOD is very prevalent, or a hybrid approach in an organization. Some personnel own their devices, others are managed completely. We've stumbled upon this in a few organizations that we've worked with, are these multifunction photocopiers. So we had a hospital that we were working with, and given the speed of business, as their clinical staff would show up very early each morning and prepare for the surgeries that were scheduled, a couple of the physicians, whoever arrived first, would take that surgical OR schedule, and they would copy it on this multifunction copier, which also happened to have a built-in SMTP server. What's interesting about this is several months before we got there, this particular hospital had implemented an encryption solution for email that sat at the essentially at the gateway level, and if it would see PHI come across, it would query that data through regular expressions and so on, and then encrypt it to its outbound destination. But here you had a group of physicians, again, not intentionally kind of circumventing technology, but sending that PHI out to private email addresses, which totally bypassed their encryption solution that they had invested in. So, without doing your required HIPAA risk analysis and staying vigilant about these types of threats in your environment, it could have been going on for many years before it was detected, and thankfully we were able to get out ahead of it a little bit. Next slide, please. So, just to surmise, we have data on multiple endpoints and multiple locations, and that does give rise to this scourge of medical identity theft, if you will. So stealing an individual's protected health information, and then using that data as well as personally identifiable information. One thing about medical information is it's very rich. It not only has medical conditions that you may be seeking treatment for, but naturally PII, could have insurance information tagged to it, as well as financial data as well. So criminals enjoy nothing more than to get that rich data set and manipulate it in a number of ways. And in fact, I think this is the 5th year now that they've released their annual study on medical identity theft. And I guess it's good news for people who like bad news, in the sense that if you look at 2014 and contrast it to 2013, it's roughly a 22% increase over a prior year. So we're seeing a greater increase. It's happening with more frequency. And I think perhaps what's most alarming about this is that individuals are willingly sharing their health insurance information with family members and friends. So, your friend John, who needs a bilateral knee replacement, doesn't happen to have medical insurance. Well, that's okay, John. I happen to have insurance, and just go impersonate me, and you can get covered for that medical need that you have. Clearly not a good idea, but the fact that people don't understand why that's not a good idea and that they could actually be altering their medical record and how that could be detrimental to their long-term health is certainly alarming. I think it also speaks to a larger issue around trying to educate the population about the risk to medical identity theft. And when you see statistics of a small subset, granted, but 167 consumers were polled, and only 43% had no idea what medical identity theft is. So those of us working in healthcare and working to secure patient data have our work cut out for us. Next slide. So we know that we need to do a better job, and we can do a better job. And kind of in parallel that cyber criminals are motivated and seeing the opportunities for theft of data. And if we look at, since as part of the HITECH Act, the breach notification requirements that were enacted in September of 2009, so if we look at all the patient information that's been breached since that time up through December 31st of 2014, it's roughly 41 million records that have been compromised. It speaks to the point of how challenging it is to enforce data protection throughout the chain of trust. I also think more recently that's alarming certainly is, and we don't know the full details of it yet. I've not worked close enough to the incident, but just based on reading, if you think about Anthem and 80 million files breached, we don't know how much of that was customer data, but it just speaks to the aggregate volume of records being compromised. So depending on what happens there, you could literally have in one fell breach surpassing the past 6 years of activity or so. So something to keep our eye on and think operationally how can we do a better job of securing systems and endpoints that have patient information on them. So what do we see? Well, we see an escalation in target attacks against covered entities, as I had mentioned, resulting in the loss of patient data. What we see when we're doing assessments in incident response and so on is the lack of visibility, oftentimes on the business associate and the subcontractor side. So we're tending to see more awareness from the hospital and health insurance side of the house, but on the BAs and subcontractors, well, there's really opportunities for improvement there. And I think in light of that, if you look at some of the Office for Civil Rights activities and some of the audits that are going to be forthcoming, they're certainly focusing that lens on business associates. Next slide. And this is kind of just a general overview of why we're seeing some of the calamity that we are and why healthcare data is sought after. The fact of the matter is it presents a number of fraud-based opportunities. So once the breach occurs, on the left-hand side you would have a compromised medical record. So if I'm a fraudster or I'm a criminal, what can I do with this information? And you're really only limited to your own creativity. So if we kind of flow to the left, we can kind of engage on the far left in insurance fraud. So I could very easily, based on the rich pool of identity information I now have access to, start submitting false claims to insurance companies, Medicare and Medicaid, and see how I might get reimbursed for those claims. Naturally, and kind of logically, I guess, you could also look to exploit prescription drug benefits. So looking for drugs like oxycodone, things that have really fair street value, and look to get a forged prescription filled or do that through some type of internet-based transaction. On the right-hand side, if we go back up to the top, one of the things I want to speak to is physician identity theft. It's really been emerging the past few years, and what that entails, and sometimes this could be an artifact of compromising medical records. You could have physician data in that record itself or as part of the database that was compromised or the record set. But this is getting access to the physician's personally identifiable information, their tax identification number, their national provider identifier, the NPI is typically publicly available information, and medical licensure information. So now you can essentially assume that identity. I'm this physician, John Smith, and I'm actually going to build out a complete false practice so that I can start writing prescriptions and seeing patients that don't exist and then billing for services that were in fact never rendered. So a significant challenge in terms of mitigating that risk, and I might add something we don't speak to explicitly on the slide is just the the escalation in tax ID fraud, not only targeting physicians but the victims of medical identity theft and general identity theft. And then lastly, kind of moving to the right of this flow diagram, if you've spent some time, and I've done some research in this area around medical identity theft and fraud, over the past few years there's been this emergence of the concept of a data broker. And there are legitimate data brokers, companies like Axiom and so on, that log and track data points about each and every one of us. But if you have this repository of patient information, you can then begin to resell it to insurance companies, pharmaceutical-based organizations, really anybody who's interested. And I can tell you that there's some really dubious organizations out there that stand up websites and are more than willing to broker this type of data. Next slide. And so just driving the point home, patient data is currency, no question. We can profit from that. We can engage in traditional identity theft. If you do a quick contrast, and I think it's another reason why we're seeing an escalation in the theft and targeting of healthcare data. If you think about credit card theft, it's still an issue, but was certainly rampant the past 10, 15 years or so. At best, credit card data finite lifespan, 2 to 3 years. However, there's this notion of persistence with your medical information. It's not going away anytime soon. You are as you were biologically constructed, and as that information starts to get altered, it could be detrimental for a number of reasons. And I would also add that if you look at some of the IRS statistics, you literally have people who have long been deceased obtaining tax refunds. So the fraudsters will stop at nothing to get access to PII, and then think of ways that they can profit from those activities. As well, when you talk to some of these individuals, they really see it as just a crime of opportunity. They're completely agnostic. Oftentimes, I have no interest. It is an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of names and personally identifiable information or healthcare data in there. I don't know these people, so therefore, why not leverage it to my advantage, particularly given a tight economy that many in the U.S. are currently facing. Next slide. And this is kind of bringing it home. One thing to bear in mind, and we don't get into it too much on today's slides, but is it's well beyond PHI. I mean, sure, that's a logical target for criminals to go after for some of the reasons we just talked about. But there's a number of other things that might attract them as well, things like a network bandwidth, storage, the stash, stolen property, and whereas and so forth, but also cash on hand. And here you have an example of some hackers in Ukraine and Russia, which were able to transfer over $1 million from a Washington-based hospital just by compromising that network, getting access to their payroll system, and then exfilling that through a number of cyber mules and so on. We talked briefly about the Anthem breach. Krebs did a nice job on bringing to light some medical records that were for sale in the underground that were stolen from a Texas life insurance firm. I just bring this to light because we hear these wildly varying numbers, and I've seen them all over the place personally. $1,000 for a healthcare kit, possibly more than that. Here Krebs is talking about $6.40 per record. Some people like to quote 50. In my experiences, I've literally seen it for cents on the dollars, medical information being sold, and in some cases given away for free. The point being that the attackers, they don't care. Once the criminal gets this information, it's a one-to-many relationship. I have one data dump. I'll sell it to how many people that are possibly interested, and sometimes I don't even have to negotiate price. Who's ever willing to meet the market demand, I'll supply it to them. If they want to pay me $1,000 per record or 50 cents, what do I care? I'm just kind of providing that conduit for fraud. Next slide. And I think this is a somewhat disturbing slide, quite honestly, from my perspective. This is directly from Health and Human Services for breaches of 500 or more records. If you do a sort and you just look at hacking/IT incidents, this speaks to the challenge that we have before us as security professionals, as individuals responsible for managing healthcare environments. And that is, you can't possibly stop or prevent something when you have no visibility whatsoever. So if you start to trend this data out, and I think I stopped here at 2013 or so, there are literally months where there's very limited to no hacking or IT-based theft occurring. Now, there's a couple things that could be going on there. Either we're not seeing this activity that's going on healthcare networks, or the bad guys are declaring theft holidays for entire months and saying, you know what, all bets are off. I don't want anybody attacking a healthcare organization. I can think you could probably arrive at a safe conclusion what's likely occurring there, and it really speaks that we need good situational awareness, and we need to be able to get visibility on our network, what's going on, as well as our endpoints. Next slide, please. And kind of lending itself to some of the potential for compromising patient data and systems. So when we do assessments, these are just things from the field that we can talk about here quickly. But so if you have a remote authentication gateway, hey, it's great. We're going to encrypt that connection from that endpoint into our internal network to make sure that none of the traffic is passing over the internet in clear text and it's sufficiently protected. Great. But when you fail to sufficiently encrypt the username and password that's initiating that session, well, you're just providing an opportunity for a criminal to eavesdrop on that communication because it's being sent in clear text. Now I have the username and password, and I can just as easily masquerade and impersonate that physician or that clinician who may have been authenticating in that particular session. Also, I think from an accountability perspective, one of the things that's I'm hoping to see improvements on, and I'm encouraged and think that we will, is around the security of electronic health record systems, the applications and databases that are built and sold to hospitals to store and process our medical records. We've worked with a number of institutions where we've seen fairly large-scale EHR implementations, expensive systems, I might add, that were implemented, and we find default settings such as username and password default settings giving us full access, root level access to back-end databases and systems. I mean, this is inexcusable in my opinion, but it does speak to, I think, secure development processes and security testing by some of the EHR vendors. So, the more that we can do as a community to get engaged and create frameworks and hold those organizations accountable, the better we're going to be long-term for sure. Next slide. And so what's changed? There's quite a bit that's changed, and I know Phil Ben will be speaking to some of that. But for years, as incident responders, as people tasked with securing networks, organizationally, they often rely on defensive technologies. So, hey, there's a visible sign that something bad is happening. Let's fall back on some type of signature database or a rule in the logic and prevent that from happening. Well, that's all well and good if you have a signature, or if it's somebody's actually looking at the alerts and can take, can respond to them. The problem is the attackers, of course, are well beyond that in many cases. Using signatureless types of attack patterns and so forth. So it's very difficult to find these things if you're not good at your detective and response capabilities and operations. And as I just alluded to, the cybercrime has matured into a full-fledged industry. I mean, make no mistake, this rivals most, if not today's free market economy. So there's a full-blown supply and demand, and it's well established. And it's a real challenge for how we can do a better job of protecting healthcare data and monitoring when it's under attack. And on the next slide. So what do we do? Thanks, Greg, for all the bad news. Now, where do we go from here? Well, I think certainly the individuals we have on the rest of today's call can give you some insights there. But, we need to think about our mindset, from a security perspective. It's often this prevailing notion that, hey, everything's okay because I haven't heard from a three-letter agency that's knocked on my door and told me they've noticed a massive exfiltration or even exfil of any regard for my network. So because I haven't heard that, things are okay, right? That's not good enough. We need to maybe change that slightly and think about, what if we just assume that we're breached? Okay, well, let's assume we're breached. How would we be able to prove that? And how can we do things like engaging hunt teams to actually go out onto our networks, onto our endpoints, and identify indicators of compromise and validate that they're legitimate, and work with our incident response frameworks and team members to go investigate those issues. So we need to improve that area and move as rapidly as we can from detection and active response. And to do that, we certainly need not only network level visibility, but also endpoint visibility. And the last thing I'll say is, kind of getting into rapid response. If your IR plan is to pick up a phone and call a third party, those third parties are, in many cases, are often highly capable, but it's more desirable to move away from calling that third party or receiving notification that you've been breached by an external entity and getting involved in first-party detection and response. And so I'll go ahead and transition over to Phil.
Thanks very much, Greg. You know, I definitely appreciate the domain expertise that you bring from having worked in the healthcare industry for so long. I wanted to take just a real quick administrative note and mention if you do have questions, we are fielding those through the question interface in the GoToWebinar control panel that you should have on your screens. We'll do our best to try and address those. With some of those, I know a lot of folks have asked for copies of the materials. We will be presenting you with a link to this recorded webcast at some point in the future. You should get that in the next day, but you will have that available, so you can look at that offline. And a couple of questions that have come in. One indicating, actually two of them that are pretty close together here, how that Christopher had mentioned that each additional human that touches any type of PHI introduces a risk, and that's absolutely a great point. Going back to Greg's slide on the current data flow of healthcare information in the overall industry, every single one of those is absolutely a potential area where you could see data loss. You know, indicating that it's not the endpoint causing the area, it's the human. We actually tend to equate those pretty closely because every endpoint is human-driven. There's none that are purely autonomous. They're either human-based code running on them, or there's actually a human interactively working with the system. Which is one of the reasons, as I'll get into in a moment, that I think the endpoint is an absolutely critical component in the overall posturing. And to a similar question, Peter had asked, what about knowing whether an employee's computer has been compromised in some way and whether the PHI has been stolen there? And I think that dovetails nicely with the previous question and comment about that being human-based. And that's certainly what we're looking at when we start to view the endpoint as an extension of the human, and that the human is an inherently failable component of our overall security posture. That's really why we've begun to focus there. Now that all brings in a tremendous segue into my component here, telling you a little bit about what we've done at Red Canary. As I mentioned, we've created an endpoint threat detection service. Our goals are pretty simple and straightforward. We want to eliminate alert fatigue. We don't want to give you hundreds or thousands of alerts per day because, let's face it, you probably don't have the manpower to look through those. If you want to look at the quintessential example of this, it's very widely reported that the Target Security Center, which is a fantastic security center, they've always been regarded as one of the best in the business. They were notified, their whole security apparatus was notified of their breach just 3 days after the breach had occurred. However, that notification came in among thousands of others, and their security team just wasn't able to wade through those to find, the way I like to describe it as a needle in a haystack is easy. What's really difficult is finding one particular needle in a giant stack of other needles while you're in the middle of a room made of magnets. We're helping you to eliminate that problem. And by doing that, we're removing the false positives from the equation. The other thing we've done is identify that among all of our clients, if we have 100 clients, we have at least 100 different workflows. Rather than trying to tell you to change your workflow around our product, we've simplified our breach or detection notifications, as you'll see in a moment here, to the point that they contain everything you need. They are truly pared down to what is most critical so that you can integrate that to your workflow however you want. And this is all because, as I just mentioned during the transition, we believe that the endpoint is the key to a comprehensive posture. Endpoint's always been the key, whether you're talking about very simple solutions like antivirus or more complex solutions like a host-based IPS potentially. The problem has always been that that's a real tough problem to solve at scale. It's real easy to deal with one endpoint. That's where we've seen the traditional approach to forensics, for example, and system-based incident response. It's really difficult to do that at scale. We're talking thousands or hundreds of thousands of endpoints. We've found ways to do that, and that's one of the reasons we're very excited about the service that we've put together here. The other thing to consider is that we do have a human element. Our human element is not a part of a pro services branch. It is packaged into our service. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But of course, let's look at our end goal. We want to make IR affordable. We want to make it predictable. We want to make that incident response process something that's continuously ongoing and doesn't have this huge cost associated with it and doesn't have a major impact to your business operations. It just needs to be a part of an ongoing process. And we've seen organizations that have embraced that methodology become very successful in this space. As I said, we eliminate the complexity associated here with the typical endpoint operation. We're not going to tell you, here's a bunch of data, you should look at this all the time. It's great when you only have one specific incident that you need to look at, and after I pass off to Ben in the last section that we'll have here today on the webcast, you'll get to see how to use Carbon Black as an incident response component. But we've taken all these observations and identified that our process integrates with them through two components. First of all, we have a very, very advanced algorithmic approach where we programmatically poll those millions and tens of millions of data points every 60 seconds and try and look for examples of where there is a suggestion that a system's been exploited. And again, doing that on the endpoint is key. We do that without signatures. We do that behaviorally based. We enrich that with a variety of intelligence feeds in that detection engine, and then we pass that off to our security operations center. Our analysts look at every single one of these events that has been raised out of the programmatic flow and identify whether or not it truly constitutes a risk. Of course, that's all well and good, but we've got to have some actionability at the end of this. And that's where we would hand this off to our customers, if they're direct customers, or to a partner implementer like Greg at Allegheny Digital, to act on that. And as you'll see in just a couple of slides, I've got examples of our notifications. Those notification messages contain everything you need to eradicate and remediate the particular threat that we've observed and confirmed, but also to scope that out through the rest of your environment. So I was really glad when Greg brought in this concept of hunt operations and hunt teams working within the network, because that's where things are going. A term that you will start to hear very, very frequently is the assumption of breach. No longer do we say we think we're secure. We need to start saying either we know we've been compromised or we just haven't found the attacker yet. Let's go find them first. Let's not let somebody else tell us where that is. So this two-component, the two boxes actually within the Red Canary component of the overall stack are, as I said, the threat detection engine and our analyst review. If you've ever heard anything on the kill chain methodology that Lockheed Martin's done a fantastic job of popularizing, this is what we're trying to push to the left. We want to push detection as far to the left as we can, because that means we're going to do that before the attacker has a chance to do any real damage. And we're going to vet and verify the intelligence sources, whether that be something as simple as known bad IP addresses to a variety of other reputation sources, and maybe to include dynamic and static binary analysis that we're doing today in order to try and identify the true level of nastiness of a particular execution event. And of course, every environment's different. If we're not currently operating in your environment, it's very difficult for me to tell you what's normal and what's abnormal. So we have instead decided to implement some analytics that help us to establish that baseline of normalcy within your environment very quickly. And then within your tailored environment, we're able to say this is okay, or this is something that you probably want to take a better look at, for example. A couple of questions that I just want to mention in particular. Question on whether we are rule-based or whether we use predictive analytics. I want to stress that we in the Red Canary component here are not rule-based. We have largely eliminated signatures from our workflow because we find them to be very easy to get by. I worked a malware case with over 2 million botnet type infections, and the groups in that example were modifying their code every 15 minutes at the end of the operation. So they were easily evading detection. So we are looking purely at behavioral situations. And also let me go back just one slide here to answer this next question. The analyst review that occurs to answer Peter's question is inside the Red Canary component of this infrastructure. So that is not a body that we expect to be sitting on your staff. That's someone that we bring in on our side and we integrate to our workflow. And then the last question that came in from Chris, better to prevent a breach than to remediate and pray. Well, you know, I've got a saying about that, and it actually works pretty well with the healthcare industry. I do not like the word prevent. Prevention fails because we are up against human attackers. Prevention needs to be done programmatically, and programmatics are very easy to thwart when you're dealing with humans who want to get into your organization. So yeah, we need to make their lives difficult. I'm not saying don't use an IDS. I'm not saying don't use a firewall. That would be absurd. I'd be laughed out of the organization if I did that. However, we can't really expect prevention to work ever. So I always say that it doesn't matter whether we're talking about breaches or pregnancy on a broad enough scale, prevention is going to fail. I think that folks in the medical industry are going to appreciate that as well, and I think that we need to do some level of prevention, but be very willing to accept a 70% solution, let's say, and then actually deal with, well, what happens next, which is that the attacker is going to get in. If they want to get in, they will get in, plain and simple. It doesn't matter how much technology you put in their way. And then one follow-up to the earlier question on being rule-based. In terms of patterns and anomaly detection, yes, we do have that built in. That's something that I can get into in another environment. It goes a little beyond the scope that we have today, but we are doing pattern-based and anomaly detection based on baselining. Note on the analyst review side, as I move back forward to this, this slide, our human-vetted notifications, again, are internal to us. And the analogy here is that even if you look at the world of chess, even if you look at an okay chess player that is supported by high-power computing, that moderate human with great technology is better able to be victorious over a 9,000 level chess player or one of the like IBM Big Blue type chess players. So we feel that the human plus the programmatics is absolutely key, and because we're bringing that in our house, we're removing this unfortunate expectation that vendors like to have, which is, here's our product. Our product solves all kinds of problems. Here's the magic box with blinking lights. Put it on your network. Well, they expect you to have 2, 3, 5, 10 people on your staff to deal with it at that point. We don't think that's fair. It's not realistic. Let's see, let me tick forward. A question that also came in. We are, to answer Michael's question on whether we have an agent, we are using Carbon Black as our sensor, and we're using their data pool, which Ben will get into later on. So here's the kill chain slide real quick, and I'm keeping an eye on time here because I want to make sure we give Ben plenty of time to hit his material as well. But the typical breach lasts a very long time. Averages right now range between 250 and 350 days, depending on who you want to trust. But that's a huge amount of time. And Mandiant just 2 weeks ago identified that the longest breach they've identified was over 6,000 days before it was discovered. The downside here is plain and simple cost. If you want the medical analogy, it's like saying, well, we hope we never have an outbreak of some particular infectious disease, and then it happens, and then saying, well, we better figure out what to do. And that's been our historic approach in the InfoSec community. I don't think that works anymore, because what you see is as soon as that data theft occurs, you've got a cost incurred. And that's going to be a cost of paying for victim notification and identity theft services, things like that. All that becomes a big cost. And then eventually it's going to be discovered 78% of the time. It's not even by your own staff. It's by somebody external. And then remediation starts. This is what I like to call SEAL team forensics. And I hate SEAL team forensics because if you're paying many hundreds of dollars per hour per person for that third-party team that Greg mentioned, then man, that's really, really just waiting for a huge, unpredictable bill. And we've got a better way to do that instead. And that's this right here. We want to provide you everything you need to remediate before that data theft occurs, which means the breach discovery through a third party never happens because you're identifying that yourself. We wanted to strike that bright vertical red line here long before anything is ever stolen, because attackers don't steal the moment they get in. Instead, they very frequently are just going to work around your network, find the information they want, and then move out when they finally steal that. So by moving that detection far to the left and something that is handled by your own team, then you're going to be able to save that money in the long run. Now I just have a couple of quick screenshots before I throw it to Ben to talk on the Carbon Black side. As I mentioned, we wanted to make this simple to integrate to your workflow. First of all, this is the main dashboard that you see here. We wanted to tell you, hey, it's working. Here's how many systems we're looking at, and here's what your last 3 months look like. Now, the detection history on the right-hand side there, each of those links to an individual detection itself. Now, I've got a screenshot of an example. This is a highly redacted one, but this is a real threat here. The first thing you see is timing. We see that when the process kicked off and when the analyst was finally letting that event out, and in this case, that was done within an hour. Our target is hours at this point, and in some cases we can do that much, much faster. But the more important thing that I want to draw your attention to is on the right-hand side. This notification includes all these extremely useful indicators of compromise, to include IP addresses and ports, to include DNS activity, registry modifications, file modifications, everything you need to, number one, remediate this individual system, which is named unimaginatively Win 7 Pro 64, but also to scope that out through the rest of your environment. We're giving you everything you need here to actually perform a credible hunt, to say, take these IOCs, pivot out to the rest of your environment, and see if there's any other cases where that type of behavior has occurred, so you can go ahead and remediate more completely, more quickly, once again, avoiding that breach and that data theft from occurring to begin with. Now, this all depends heavily on endpoint data, of course. And what you've got here is the atoms of information that come out of Carbon Black that we do use. And these are used proactively in the Red Canary component, but I want to throw to Ben at this point and let Ben speak to using this type of wealth of information in the incident response capacity as well, because it's extremely useful in both of those scenarios.
Sure. So thanks, Phil. It's great to reconnect with you. As you guys probably heard, Phil and I spent, I don't know, 4 or 5 years working together and doing some really cool stuff in the defense and intelligence world. So really good to reconnect. If you can advance the next slide, I'll dive right in. So, you know, Carbon Black and Bit9, we came together. We're really two different products, two different solutions. If you think about Bit9, it's more about enforcement, about hardening your system, more about trust, like badging in, badging out. If you think of the real-world physical security model, usually it's, you know a subset of the human population is allowed in your building, so you let them in, and everyone else has to be signed in or just is denied, right? So that's more of the Bit9 positive security model. And Carbon Black is more of the, hey, we're going to sit back and we're just going to record everything. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with this, and it can be used anywhere from like a 7-Eleven camera, where when you have an incident, you rewind the tape and you see what happened, right? 7-Eleven doesn't install a camera, during a breach or during a robbery. They install it ahead of time so that they can rewind the tape. Or it can be used more like a casino, where people are looking at the data all the time to detect, suspicious or malicious behavior, right? In this case, obviously on a computer, not in a casino. Can you advance? And so, Carbon Black, the fundamental philosophy is to collect as much as you can about the endpoint activity, right? So say the second stage payload gets detected. Well, most traditional tools, assuming you even collect the fact that the second stage payload was detected, they're not going to get you back to the left side here, to what actually kicked this off, to what you call root cause. And in this scenario, maybe AV or something is actually alerting on the second stage payload, but the first stage payload is undetected. And so with Carbon Black and actually recording everything that's going on, seeing the parent-child relationship, seeing what binaries are running, etc., you could actually look elsewhere in your environment for the first stage payload, because maybe on other systems it's pulling down a different payload that's not detected, but it's still using the same first stage payload. Or you can look at, hey, where is Java just running an unsigned process, or where's something injecting into Explorer? So you can rewind the tape and get to root cause, but you can also start building up both behavioral patterns to look for, as well as indicators of compromise or indicators of risk to look throughout your environment. If you can build this out. And so I kind of already went over this, but traditionally you just look at what got detected, and maybe you collect a little data then. But it's kind of like 7-Eleven. You don't install a security camera during a robbery, right? Because it's kind of too late. And so build it out a little more. And so we're collecting everything, keep building it out, and really just highlight within this data set, and then finally get to root cause. As the final part of this slide, you really want to get to that left side so you can fill your gap, you can improve your posture, and try to make it not happen again tomorrow, right? What do a lot of companies do right now? They detect something and they re-image, but they don't actually fix the problem. They don't learn. The attackers are adapting all the time. Why aren't we? Next slide, please. And so another way to think about this too is, again, kind of picking on AV, but this is kind of throughout your cyber defenses, is something happens, and at the time that it happens, either it's known good, or it's known bad, or it's somewhere in the middle. But if it's not known bad, it's typically allowed to run or happen, right? And then it's not just that it's allowed to happen, it's that something like AV or IDS or whatever isn't going to collect everything that's doing. It's not going to record the activities. And if you build this slide out a little bit, there's all this stuff that usually happens after something like a malicious binary runs or a malicious human gets into your environment that we should be able to detect on. Abnormal behavior, account compromise, lateral movement, data exfil, and especially with you start kicking into the more sophisticated attacks that are actually humans on keyboard, right? What are they going to do? They're going to typically get credentials, and then once they get credentials, what are they? They're an insider. And so they might not even be dropping malicious binaries or installing implants or malware. They might just be logging in and then opening a connection to your server, or just moving that way through account credentials, dumping the credentials from the Active Directory server, that kind of thing. So if you're collecting the right data, you can actually start looking for this kind of thing too, not just things that are like suspicious binaries, but hey, this user has never logged into this machine before, and they've never used this share before, and they've never connected to FTP or used FTP.exe before, which by the way is sending all your data out. And so it's really you can think of it kind of like analytics, comparing what's going on now to what's normally going on, as well as what's going on now on certain machines to other machines, right? It's similar to a credit card model where they try to predict your normal spending, and so when it's outside of your spending, that's when you get flagged, because there's too many ways that a stolen credit card, or in this case a compromise, there's too many like malicious binaries or malicious command lines, different accounts that could be compromised. So you got to start trying to figure out what's normal, and then looking for things outside that, and keep building, please. And again, you can't know everything bad ahead of time. Now, it's not to say you don't want to look for certain things. The FBI puts out an InfraGuard alert, or you see CryptoLocker, IOCs and MD5s and stuff. Yeah, let's tell you about that when it happens. But ultimately, you have to do more than that. Next slide, please. And so, just as a conceptual level to think about it, typically your SOC or your security guys, whatever, they're looking at individual alerts. And a lot of times, or even events, right? A lot of times those events are just pretty much isolated. Like it's just like these black dots. Like I don't know much about them. They all look kind of the same. I don't know where to start. But if you go forward one and you add intelligence, you start prioritizing based on reputation or other information. Could be from your own team. It could be from these different threat intel providers, these different ISAC, threat sharing communities, that kind of stuff. But you don't have to stop there either. You make it more local to your environment. So you start looking at stuff like prevalence and frequency. If we go to the next build here, where you're not just combining reputation, you're also saying how often does this occur in my environment? If it's rare and thought to be really bad, well, that kind of goes together. If it's rare and, if it's really common and thought to be really bad, well, either I have a lot of compromised machines, which is possible, or the threat intel's bad. But either way, you're just getting much more understanding out of your data. And then finally, if we go to the fourth build here, relationships. What binary is making that network connection? What binary is spawning that other binary, right? You build out there? Yeah. And so even if I have a suspicious, unknown binary and everything it does is known good, okay, I'm going to prioritize that lower than something that's a bunch of suspicious activity, like a suspicious binary communicating to a domain that I know nothing about that looks weird, you know, that kind of stuff. Because again, it's all about saving humans time. And this is why you know, people like Red Canary like building on top of this, because we have all this nice data, and then they take it a step further. You know, we're very much a platform. They take it a step further and add their own, you know, algorithms, their own intelligence, their own people on top of it to really optimize this data set. And finally, if we finish this build here, keep going a little bit and pop up here. There we go. So, you know, one more. If you see like an SVC host.exe ran on the left side versus I told you, hey, a new unsigned binary launched an SVC host as a non-standard user and made a network connection. Well, SVC host runs like 7 or 8 times in every Windows machine, so that's just kind of noise. But on the right side, that's much more valuable, and a human can act much faster. And so, you know, just thinking about conceptually how your analysts, how your security team is receiving data, how fast can they act on everything, right? That's really a fundamental approach we take at Bit9 and Carbon Black. Next slide. And I know we're running out of time here. You know, we're continuously recording. We also have this notion of live response, where you can actually isolate a machine from the network, actually connect into it through our product, and start doing your remediation. We have all sorts of, you know, threat intelligence from our own providers, and then people like Red Canary do their own on top of that. Really, again, it's about root cause, because you've got to fix the gaps. You've got to solve the problems. Most of your alerts are going to be from the same root cause, so you've got to fix those, and then immediately you're going to save time. Mac, Windows, and Linux we support, and then we're very open. Again, that's why folks like Red Canary love us, because we're very much API-driven, so it's easy to integrate with other products, but then also build on top of it and really leverage our data. Next slide, please. Yep. And back to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Ben. As you said, great to work together again. And you know, from both Greg and myself, we definitely see that Bit9 Carbon Black provides a tremendous value in terms of a sensor package. We love the post-incident ability that having the video camera, the security camera after the event, it really makes IR fast and affordable. And then on the proactive side, being able to remediate quickly is clearly a big key for us. I will leave this slide up, so if you have any other questions, you know, more detailed questions that we didn't have a chance to get to during the presentation, you can definitely let us know. We'd be happy to talk to you about this and some of the other things that we have in process. Just taking a look at the question board here, question about supporting YARA rules. Ben, I think that you'd be the right one to answer that if Carbon Black has any ability to support those or any other type of rules from an external ingestion point of view.
Yeah, so we have something called watch lists, which really look at behavior, as well as we can look for certain IOCs, certain indicators like hashes, IPs, domains, etc. We do also make a copy and deduplicate our copies of every single binary that executes anywhere on your endpoints that have Carbon Black, and send those back to a central server. And so what we do is we have customers who then, as the binaries come in, you can run YARA rules against them. You have to use our API to do it, but it's trivial. And then, you know, it's really because we're so open and we have a messaging bus, we have a REST API, all this other stuff, it's really easy to build on top of this. Again, that's why folks like Red Canary really like us. And then, you know, when we alert, it's really easy to send that to a SIM like a QRadar, to a Splunk, etc., or just email alerts, that kind of stuff, as well as programmatically. You can say, hey, I'm going to write some Python code or whatever, subscribe when I get an alert, do X, Y, and Z, right? So it's very cool.
All right. I also wanted to mention, Mimi, I see your question in here. That's a little more specific than we can get into in the presentation. I'm going to ask Greg to follow back up with you directly on that one. We'll have your contact information. I didn't want you to think that we forgot about you. And then the last question that came in terms of supporting System Z servers that contain the database itself. So when we talk about endpoints, important thing to note is we're talking about both individuals' systems that they will use on keyboard, as well as server endpoints as, in that type of a definition. So we do run equally on all those different flavors, as Ben mentioned, on the Windows, the Mac, and the Unix side. So we would look for behaviors that have to that suggest exploitation has occurred regardless of whether it's server or a database or web server or any other kind. So I hope that answers your question as well. Greg, any last thoughts or notes that you wanted to add in, sir?
No, guys. I know we're coming up against the hard stop here at 2. But certainly if there's any questions related to medical ID theft or some of the subject matter that I covered off on, by all means, please feel free to reach me at the contact information on the screen.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Let's see. Wanted to thank everybody for your time today. I realize that that's not an easy commodity to come across, so I hope that we were able to provide you with some good information that you can use. Look forward to speaking with you on this again. Our contact information isn't here just as a formality. We look forward to hearing from you if you've got questions on how we may be able to support you in your environments. And you'll receive a link within the next day containing that'll lead you to a recorded version of this webcast, so you can follow back up on that and ask any other questions as well. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and great weekend, depending on where in the world you might be. We'll talk to you soon, I hope. Thank you.